Hello painters! In this video I want to share with you some information about paper, specifically paper that's used to work with wet media like instant coffee, ink, or watercolor. So what you need to know about paper is all papers are assigned a weight. And when you look at paper and buy it in a pad, you'll see at some point they'll tell you not only the dimensions of the paper you're buying, but the weight. So this is a 140-pound paper. And what you need to know is that the paper industry, when the paper mill makes paper, they actually use 500 sheets, which is called a ream of paper, as their unit of measurement. So what that means to you, and you'll see on this one, this is photocopy paper. This is 20-pound paper, okay? Really, really lightweight. What that means to you is, they also use a standard measurement. So that means that 22 inches by 30 inches, a sheet of 22 by 30, 500 sheets of 22 by 30 of this paper will weigh 140 pounds. That's a lot of information, probably more than what you need to know. What you really should remember, though, is the higher the number, the thicker the paper. The lower the number, the thinner the paper, okay? And that'll really be important for you to know, because I'm sure you all experienced using watercolor on a sheet of like copy paper or sketchbook paper, which is typically 20 to 60 pound, and it wrinkles right away, right? It bubbles up and it becomes really frustrating. It rips through, doesn't perform well. What you have to think about with paper is think about it like a sponge. And when you add water to it, it starts to expand, right? The thicker your paper, the more it's going to be able to withstand that moisture without it tearing or bubbling and not being useful to paint with, okay? So we use a paper of 140 pounds or higher for any wet media, and I wouldn't recommend you use anything less than 140, okay? Expensive papers can go up to all the way up to 600 pounds, and you buy it by the single sheet, typically, like $10 a sheet, and it's very thick. But 140 will be a good place for you to start. Another thing you should know about paper is it typically will have what's called a tooth or no tooth. So I think if you can see, there's a texture when you hold it up to the light. You want to put the most active tooth or the active pattern face up to paint on. You'll see when you look at the paper again that you're buying that typically it will tell you what kind of paper it is. And this one, it says cold press. I prefer cold press for our wet medium, but some artists will use a hot press. What that means is that when it's made at the paper industry, they either press it between cold plates or they roll it or press it between hot heated plates or rollers. A hot press has no tooth at all. It's very smooth in texture. And this is often good for drawing or ink work. Whereas the cold press is much more, useful for pulling the pigment and holding it in the page. So often cold press papers are used for pastel work or painting, okay? The last bit I want to show you is how to stretch your piece of paper. So when we go back to that analogy of the sponge, your paper is going to want to expand. One way of controlling its expansion and helping it to always go back to dry flat is to stretch it on a board. This is called a dry stretch because we're just stretching the paper while it's dry. And you can see all I'm doing is using a generous amount of masking tape, ripping it to the lengths of my width and length, and I'm just overlapping my paper here to create kind of a white border or enough that I can have this sealed down effectively to my board. Take your fingernail and push it down firmly. I'm doing about 1/4 inch. Attempt to make that even for yourself, because in the end you'll have a nice clean white border when you pull this off. But really this will function to keep your paper flat. So as we start introducing, paint on here in water, it might bubble up a little bit after it gets overly saturated. You'll have to listen to your paper and watch it. If you let it dry in between, it will come back to flat because we've stretched it. All right, that is your info on paper and how to stretch.